This is the TS80P, the latest soldering iron from the makers of the TS100 and the TS80. One of the biggest complaints about the TS80 was the lack of power delivery support and also the low overall wattage. With the TS80P, they've added power delivery support and bumped the wattage to 30 watts. So how does that perform, and will it dethrone my favored TS100, which I've been using for about 3 years? Before we get started with the review, I just want to list some things that could be considered as potential biases I have while reviewing this product. The first is that Miniware sent me this iron for free. I'm not required to say anything about the iron, I'm not getting paid for this review, but they have asked me to put their name in the title and a link in the description, and I was okay with this. They did send me this badass bandana though, so I'll try not let that sway my opinion. The other thing is that the links in the description are more than likely affiliate links, so I will get some benefit if you buy the iron through those links. The other one, which is kind of a weird one, is that if you're familiar with my streams recently, I've been working on a product called the TS100 Flexi Friend, which is an add-on for the TS100 that adds USB-C power delivery support. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started. Let's take a look at what comes with the soldering iron. So as far as I can tell, there are two packages. There is this one, which this shop has labeled TS80P and power. So it comes with the iron and a power supply and a couple of additional things. And then this is the one that I got, which is just the soldering iron and this pencil tip. There is only $9 between the two, and I would definitely recommend getting the one with power for that price difference. First off, you get this power supply, which is the max power that a TS80P can take, so that's obviously going to be useful. You also get the grounding strap, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is actually the most important thing I can think of with this kit. It is a flexible USB-C to USB-C cable, and that is a complaint I have about using my TS80P here, that I don't have that kind of a cable. I can't see it available to buy anywhere, so I'm stuck with using the cable that came with my MacBook, which is long and heavy and not flexible at all. Another thing you might be interested in getting is additional tips. Both kits come with a fine nose point tip, which I don't particularly like. The tips are compatible with the TS80 ones, they're the same, and they cost about $20 each. Now this is about double what a TS100 tip costs, which is about $10. My favorite tip for the TS100 was the BC2, and the equivalent of it on the TS80 is the BC02. And I've bought one from China, but I actually noticed that this seller ships them from Germany, so I probably would have got it much quicker, so whoops. Another thing the TS80P doesn't come with is a stand. Now it doesn't technically need a stand because the tip will be kept off the table just by its case, but I really don't like the way it rolls. It doesn't roll quite as much when there's a cable in, but I just don't really like it. I'm currently using my TS100 stand, which is the crappy thing that came with the TS100 in a binder clip, and it actually works pretty well. One thing that might be worth mentioning is the packaging feels a lot less premium on the TS80P than it did on the TS100. Now this is not something I care about at all. The box arrived safe and sound from China, that's all I care about, and the box was going to get dumped either way, so who cares? So let's take a look at the iron itself, and I'll be comparing it to the TS100. The body of the iron is about 10 centimeters long and the tip is about 6 centimeters long. If we compare this to the TS100, the body is about the same, but the tip on the TS100 is almost 8 centimeters, so that's nearly 2 centimeters shorter. This provides a nicer tip to grip ratio that some people prefer, but I'm quite used to the TS100, so I don't know if that's a big deal for me, but it might be applicable for you. The TS80P, like the TS80, has a metal casing which should be more robust than the TS100's plastic shell. Now this TS100 is 3 years old and is still in perfect condition, but it has lived a sheltered life in my office. I have seen some people complain that theirs is cracked. The TS80P weighs 37 grams, while the TS100 weighs 31 grams. Now this isn't a lot. If you measured that difference out in sugar, that sugar would only weigh 6 grams. The TS80P also has this, a really satisfyingly clicky eject mechanism. I'm not fully sure how useful this is. I think it's for removing the tip when it's hot, but you still have to touch the tip after you eject it, so I don't know if it's a huge advantage. It feels really satisfying though. Just like the TS80, it has an OLED screen. It seems to be the same one that's in the TS100, and it has these kind of rocker buttons which feel quite nice with their aluminium casing. But yeah, it works well. Menus easy to use. Yeah, no complaints. Next, I want to look at the compatibility of the TS80P with different power supplies. But before we do that, I think it's really important to give just a quick introduction to power delivery and how it works. I've been doing a lot of research around power delivery for the FlexiFriend project, and I do plan to make a future video around that, so if this is something that interests you, let me know in the comments below. So if we take a look at this diagram here, it is a representation of power negotiation between a source and a sink for power delivery. So a source is a power supply, like your battery bank or whatever, and the sink is the device that's pulling the power, like the TS80P in this case. The important part is this source capabilities that's sent between the source and the sink. So in this example here, the power supply unit is saying I can do 5 volts at 3 amps or 9 volts at 3 amps. And then it is up to the sink to decide which one of those that it wants, or if any of them will work for it. Don't worry if this doesn't make full sense now. I'll be illustrating this with examples using real power supplies and what's going on with the TS80P. The next thing that's really important to note about the TS80P is that it will draw different amounts of current based on the amount of voltage that's being supplied. So this works because of Ohm's law. The tip is a fixed resistance, it's 4.5 ohms. The voltage is being set to be 12 volts or 9 volts or whatever. So that means the current required to heat that tip at the different voltages is going to change. Now that we've that out of the way, we can take a look at how the TS80P performs with these 6 different PD power supplies and this one quick charge power supply. I want to give a huge thanks to my GitHub sponsors for helping to support the channel. Their support directly funded the purchasing of these power supplies for testing with the FlexiFriend, but we can definitely use them here too. Let's take a look at how each of the chargers get on, and then we'll review the results. So first up is my 87 watt charger, and it worked at 12 volts. Next up is my 61 watt charger. It worked at 9 volts. Next we'll take a look at the 60 watt battery bank. It worked at 12 volts. The 45 watt power bank worked at 12 volts as well. The 30 watt supply worked at 9 volts. The 18 watt supply did not work. It displayed low voltage on the iron. And finally, the quick charge power supply worked at 9 volts. Let's take a look at these results and we'll explain them now. So let's start with this fake MacBook charger and why I marked it in yellow. The reason I marked it in yellow is because I wasn't expecting it to negotiate 12 volts, because it's not marked on the power supply that it does 12 volts. It says 5 volts, 9 volts and 20 volts. So where it got 12 volts from, I'm not sure. Next, the genuine Mac charger has the same markings on the power supply in terms of 5 volts, 9 volts and 20 volts, and it negotiated 9 volts. If we go back and look at this diagram, the power supply offered its capabilities and the TS80P chose the one that suited it best. So because there was no 12 volts, it was able to drop back to the 9 volt one and use that instead. The two power banks worked fine at 12 volts, no problems there. One thing worth mentioning while testing with this 45 watt power bank using this black power meter, it wouldn't turn on for me in some cases, and I don't know why that was, but I have not witnessed this using the red inline power meter or just plugging it in directly, so I have a feeling maybe it's a problem with that power meter. I don't know, it has worked for other devices though. Next, let's take a look at the Amazon Basic supply, which also negotiated 9 volts because it doesn't support 12 volts. And this is going to be a pretty common problem for the TS80P because 12 volts isn't actually that common of a standard for power delivery. I'm actually quite surprised that it is able to do the 9 volts at all because it is not mentioned on the documentation or even on the back of the box that it can do 9 volt power delivery. I thought if the supply couldn't do 12 volts at the required current, you'd just be out of luck. Next, let's talk about this U-green power supply which failed. It displayed low voltage on the iron itself. So the only other person I've seen testing the TS80P that used something other than the supplied power supply is Dave Jones of the EEV blog, and he used an 18-watt power bank and saw the same thing. Now, while he was testing it, when he plugged it into a power measuring module, he got it to work, which is kind of strange, right? But the weird thing is that I tested this iron a week ago using this exact power supply, same cable, same tips, same everything, and it worked for me too. So I'm not fully sure what's going on. One potential theory I have is that the iron measures the resistance of the tip and uses that in the calculation of what current it needs in the negotiation phase of the power delivery. So if it measures the resistance to be a little bit lower than previously, then it will require more amps at 9 volts than it did the last time. So that might explain why it worked one time for me and not the other time, and then the same for Dave Jones. This is something that could potentially be fixed in a future software update. The TS80P uses the FUSB 302 power delivery IC module, which is the same one that Great Scott looked at in a recent video. And finally, the quick charge supply worked as expected at 9 volts. Okay, there has to be some YouTuber law against this or something, but I'm over 10 minutes into a soldering iron review video and I hadn't shown any soldering yet, so let's change that. So this is me soldering my D1 Mini HID shield prototype. It is a board made up mainly of surface mount components, 0603 resistors and caps, this button here, and then the CH552. And the TS80P was able to solder these things no problem at all. I still really don't like this needle nose tip, but that is not a problem for the TS80P. I would have the same complaints if I was using the equivalent tip on my TS100. But it was able to do everything fine, it felt nice to solder with, so no complaints here whatsoever. This is by no means a torture test, but it was able to do the male USB header no problem too, including the shield. Here's a shot of me soldering the headers of a D1 Mini, and it was fine again. It was a little bit slower than I would have liked, but again I'm putting that down to the tip because I think I'd have the same problems with the TS100. I did find it a little bit easier as I was going on and I was getting used to using this tip again, and yeah, it was fine, no problems. Okay, back to stats. Next I want to take a look at how fast the TS80P heats up at the different voltage levels. I'm going to measure going to 350 degrees. The reason I'm picking 350 is I've already measured this for the TS100, and at 24 volts it took 8 seconds and at 12 volts it took 45 seconds. I'm also going to compare the TS100 at 20 volts through my Flexi friend, and I honestly don't know how it will do compared to the TS80P. It will obviously be slower than the 24 volts of the TS100, so it'll be interesting. And the results are in, and this won't be good for sales for the Flexi friend, but despite drawing almost 20 watts less than the Flexi friend, the TS80P heated up to 350 slightly faster than the TS100. Now this wasn't a scientific test at all. I didn't control the temperature of the tips, although both of them should have been room temperature, and I also only ran the test once, and to really get a good view of it you should probably run it multiple times and take an average. But yep, TS80P definitely worked faster for this test. Let's take a look at how accurate the iron is when we set it to a temperature, or at least check as much as we can using one of these cheap thermometers I bought on Amazon. So I've the TS80P set to 350 degrees and I'm touching it off the thermometer here. Originally it doesn't go much past 325, but when I lift it off and put it back on again, it goes all the way up to 345 and a little bit more. If we run the same test with the TS100, again set to 350 degrees, you'll notice that it never goes past 325. So that means that the TS100 runs colder than the TS80P, or at least it did in this test. So I can't say for sure the thermometer is accurate, but without a different way of measuring it, we have to assume that it is, so the TS80P seems to be more accurate. Normally in soldering iron review videos, the reviewer does some form of torture test using a 4-layer PCB with a massive ground plane or something along those lines, but I don't really do that kind of soldering. I normally just work on 2-layer boards, but I have this flex wire here that is as big a wire I have. It was able to solder that fine, and then I was able to solder it to the XT60 connector, no problem as well. It was a little bit slower than you'd expect, but this was with the iron at 350 degrees, which, you know, it could have been bumped up more than that, and it was perfect, so no complaints. Before we get to the conclusion, I want to take a look at the ground strap and why you might use it. This is the one that came with my TS100. I don't know if it's the same as the TS80P one, but it fits, so it probably is. It attaches to a screw on the underside of the TS80P up near the USB end. The reason why you might want to use the ground strap is hinted at by BigClive.com in a comment on EEV Blog's video, where he asks, is there any AC voltage present on the tip? I'm testing with my genuine Mac charger. My multimeter is set to AC mode. This yellow wire is connected to earth, and you can see I'm measuring 108 volts AC on the tip. Oh dear. All the chargers I tested had some AC voltage on the tip other than the battery banks, which would have been more surprising if they did. This isn't unique to the TS80P though. The same thing is seen on the TS100 even with the barrel jack connectors. If we run the same test again, except we'll attach the ground clip to earth, you'll see that there's no AC voltage present on the tip anymore. So does that mean you always need to use the ground strap? And to be honest, this was my first time ever using it. I've never attached it to anything. Smarter people than me will hopefully explain it in the chat, but if you have sensitive components, then maybe you do need to use this. My biggest problem with it is that it makes soldering more unpleasant. You now have another wire attached to you that needs to go somewhere else, and it's another thing just weighing down the top of the iron, and I don't like it. I genuinely think that if you're doing work on sensitive components, that a decent power bank is the way to go. You should get 4 or 5 hours use out of something like this, and yeah, that should cover most solder sessions. Okay, I know this has been wrecking some of your heads, but we'll finally take off the sticker from the screen. Yeah, that was anticlimactic. It actually fell off earlier. You might notice that the little tab was facing up in some clips and down in others. Sorry. So in conclusion, I think the TS80P is a really nice iron. It does have some potential flaws. I think that flexible USB cable is essential, and I hope that they make it available to buy without buying the power supply edition. So for the moment though, I would definitely recommend, if there's only $9 between the two, I would definitely recommend getting the version with the power supply just for that flexible cable even. As for power supply compatibility, I think it was better than I thought it would be originally because it does support 9 volts power delivery. So I would just be really careful when you're buying your power supply that it supports 12 volts at 2.6 amps or whatever is needed for this, because we've seen issues with the 18 watt supply. So this iron at 9 volts should draw 18 watts, but the 18 watt supply wasn't able to power it. So I think, you know, just getting one that meets the bare minimum power standards is a bad idea. I think you'll have a bad time with that. So just bump it up to a bigger one and just double check it does 12 volts at the required amps, or you're not going to get full power out of your TS80P. So should you buy one over a TS100, or if you already have a TS100? That's a difficult question to answer because soldering irons are a lot to do with preference. Pound for pound boxer style, I think the TS80P is a better iron. It heats up faster, it draws less power, the metal case is nice, and the shorter tip to grip distance is probably beneficial to most people. But the only problem with that is that price-wise, it's almost double what a TS100 is. So pound for pound, UK pound style, I don't know if it is that much better, if it's worth the extra amount. The other thing to note is that the tips for the TS100 are about half the price. So if you wanted to build up a collection of tips, you would be cheaper doing it with a TS100. Another thing to take into consideration is how you're going to power the iron. If you have a bunch of lipos and that's what you want to use to power it, the TS100 would be a much better option. If you have USB-C power banks, maybe the TS80P will be the better option, or a flexi friend with this one. But yeah, like if you have a bunch of barrel jack power supplies that will work already, you could save yourself a bit of money by getting or using them with the TS100. So yeah, consider that too. So yeah, I'm not sure. I'm still very happy with my TS100. Definitely until I get a flexible cable solution for the TS80P, I wouldn't even consider swapping over. I really like the flexible cable for my TS100. So until I get that sorted, I will continue using my TS100. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. This was a much longer video than I originally planned it would be. Sorry it's been so long since I last made a video. This is my new office. I moved house. There was a lot of stuff, yeah. But as a treat for you for staying till the end, my daughter has a question that she's not going to ask you. Tell them to like and subscribe.
No.